A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine a Jewish person who believes the modern state of Israel is religiously illegitimate, even a form of heresy, yet they choose to live in the heart of Jerusalem. To an outsider, that sounds like a massive contradiction. But for thousands of people, it is a completely coherent, deeply felt theological position. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the minority Jewish view that opposes Zionism on religious grounds. He wants to know who these groups are, what percentage of the global population they represent, and how on earth they justify living in a state they don't believe should exist.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn. This is a phenomenal topic because it forces us to look past the political headlines and into the world of Talmudic jurisprudence and messianic expectation. It is a world where the primary conflict isn't necessarily between Jews and Arabs, but between different visions of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is helping us synthesize these complex demographic and theological threads.
It's a good thing we had the AI help, because the math on this is actually pretty tricky. When we talk about anti-Zionism in a Jewish context, most people think of secular campus activists or specific political movements. But Daniel is asking about the religious side people, who aren't necessarily progressive in the Western sense, but are actually deeply traditional. So, Herman, let's start with the hard numbers. What percentage of the world's 16 million Jews actually fall into this camp?
It depends entirely on how you define the terms. If you look at a 2024 Jewish Federation survey, about 7% of United States Jews identify as anti-Zionist, but that's a broad political umbrella. If we're talking about the strictly religious, ideologically committed anti-Zionists, the ones who reject the state on principle from a Torah perspective, the numbers are much smaller but incredibly influential. You have groups like Neturei Karta, which is the most visible but also the smallest, with maybe 5,000 to 10,000 members globally. Then you have the Satmar Hasidim, who are the heavyweights here. They have roughly 100,000 to 150,000 adherents.
So we're looking at maybe 1%, give or take, of the global Jewish population? That's a tiny sliver, yet they seem to punch way above their weight in terms of visibility and the intensity of their conviction.
They do, and that's because their opposition isn't just a policy disagreement. For the Satmar and groups like the Ida Hacharitis in Jerusalem, the existence of a secular Jewish state is a theological catastrophe. To understand why, you have to go back to a specific passage in the Talmud, in Tractate Ketubot 111a. It's known as the Three Oaths.
I've heard you mention these before. This is the idea that there's a divine stay of execution on returning to the land, right?
Precisely. The tradition says that when the Jews went into exile, God made them swear three things. First, that they wouldn't scale the wall, which means returning to the land of Israel en masse by force. Second, that they wouldn't rebel against the nations of the world where they were living. And third, God made the other nations swear they wouldn't oppress the Jews too much. The religious anti-Zionist argument is that by creating a state through political and military means without the arrival of the Messiah, the Zionist movement violated those oaths.
So in their eyes, the state of Israel isn't just a secular project. It's an attempt to force the hand of God. It's like trying to jump the fence instead of waiting for the gate to be opened.
That is the exact framing. Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, the founder of the modern Satmar movement, laid this out in his foundational text, Va'oel Moshe, published in 1961. He argued that Zionism was a satanic deception. He even went so far as to suggest that the Holocaust was a divine punishment for the sin of the Zionist movement trying to end the exile prematurely. It's an incredibly harsh, uncompromising worldview that puts them at odds with almost every other branch of Judaism.
It's also a worldview that leads to some pretty wild political bedfellows. I mean, we've all seen the photos of Neturei Karta members meeting with leaders in Iran or participating in conferences that are openly hostile to Israel. Is that just a PR stunt? Or does it flow naturally from that theology?
For Neturei Karta, it flows directly from the logic that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but with a religious twist. They believe that because the Zionist state is a rebellion against God, any force that opposes that state is, in some sense, helping to restore the correct order of the Jewish exile. Now, most other anti-Zionist groups, like the Satmar, actually distance themselves from Neturei Karta's public stunts. They think meeting with people who want to physically harm Jews is dangerous and a desecration of God's name. But the underlying theology that the state has no religious legitimacy is a shared foundation.
Okay, so if the state is illegitimate, or even satanic in the view of some of these groups, we have to tackle the paradox Daniel mentioned. Why live there? Why would a Satmar Hasid or a member of the Ida Hacharidas choose to live in a neighborhood like Mia Sharim, right in the middle of a Zionist entities they claim to despise?
This is where we have to make a distinction that is absolutely critical, the distinction between Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. For these groups, the land is holy. It was given by God. There are hundreds of commandments, or mitzvot, that you can only perform if you are physically standing on that soil. You have laws about agriculture, tithes, and the sanctity of Jerusalem itself that are independent of who happens to be running the government.
So they view themselves as living in the land, but not participating in the state.
They see themselves as the guardians of the city. That's actually what Neturei Karta means in Aramaic. They argue that their presence in Jerusalem predates modern Zionism by centuries. Many of these families have been there for 7, 8, or 9 generations. To them, the Zionists are the newcomers, the occupiers of a holy space that should be governed by divine law, not parliamentary procedure.
It's almost like they're living in a self-imposed exile within the land. They're physically there, but they're trying to remain socially and politically invisible to the state apparatus.
That's a great way to put it, and they go to extreme lengths to maintain that separation. Many of these communities refuse any form of government funding. They don't take money for their schools, they don't take welfare, and they certainly don't vote in national elections. They speak Yiddish instead of Hebrew for daily life because they consider Hebrew Loshen Kodesh to be too holy for buying groceries or talking about the weather. Using Zionist Hebrew is, to them, another form of assimilation.
But surely you can't be totally separate in 2026. I mean, they use the roads, they use the electricity grid, the water. How do they square the practical realities of a modern infrastructure with this total ideological rejection?
There's definitely a spectrum of pragmatic non-Zionism. You have the extreme end, like the Satmar and Neturei Karta, who try to be as autonomous as possible. They have their own private kashrut certifications, their own rabbinical courts, and their own charity networks that are funded by wealthy donors in New York and London. Then you have the broader Haredi world groups like the Litvish yeshiva communities who might not be Zionist in their heart of hearts, but they've made a deal with the state. They participate in the Knesset to protect their interests, but they still won't sing the national anthem or celebrate Independence Day.
It sounds like a constant state of friction, and that friction has been getting a lot hotter lately, hasn't it? Daniel mentioned the conscription crisis. If you don't believe in the state, you definitely don't want your kids dying in its army.
That is the ultimate flashpoint. For decades, there was a status quo agreement where full-time Torah students were exempt from the draft. But between 2024 and 2026, the Israeli Supreme Court basically dismantled those exemptions. For the anti-Zionist factions, this is seen as an existential declaration of war. They don't just see it as a policy change, they see it as the Zionist entity, trying to forcibly secularize their youth and break their religious resolve. We've seen mass protests where thousands of men are holding signs saying, "We will die rather than enlist." To them, serving in the IDF isn't just a chore, it's an act of religious betrayal.
You know, it's interesting to think about the social cost of this. If you're a young person growing up in one of these anti-Zionist enclaves in Jerusalem, your entire world is built on this rejection. But you're surrounded by a country that is increasingly nationalistic and, in many ways, increasingly religious itself. Does the barrier between these groups ever break down?
It's getting harder to maintain the walls. What's fascinating is that while the anti-Zionists are holding their ground, a large portion of the non-Zionist Haredi population is actually moving toward the right. They're becoming more nationalistic even if they don't use the label Zionist. But for the hardcore ideological groups, that just makes them dig in deeper. They see the religious Zionists, the people who wear knitted yarmulkes and serve in the army, as even more dangerous than the secular Zionists because they're mixing the holy with the profane.
It's the purity argument. If you're going to be a secular state, at least be honest about it. Don't try to wrap it in a prayer shawl.
There's a famous saying attributed to some of these rabbis. The Zionists haven't made a state for Jews. They've made a state for Goyim who happen to speak Hebrew. It sounds incredibly elitist and harsh, but from their perspective, Jewish identity is defined entirely by the covenant at Sinai. If you remove the covenant and replace it with a flag and a tank, you've created something else entirely.
Let's talk about the geography for a second. Daniel asked about those living in Israel, but a huge portion of this movement is in the United States, specifically in places like Kiryas Joel and Williamsburg. Is there a difference in how the theology plays out when you're in Brooklyn versus when you're in Jerusalem?
There is a massive psychological difference. If you're a Satmar Hasid in Kiryas Joel, New York, your anti-Zionism is mostly theoretical and philanthropic. You're living in a pluralistic democracy, you're sending money back to the impoverished anti-Zionists in Jerusalem, and you're protesting at the United Nations. It's a very safe form of dissent. But if you're in Mea Shearim, you are on the front lines. You are seeing the border police every day, you're dealing with the municipal tax collectors, and your kids are the ones facing the draft. The Jerusalemite anti-Zionists tend to be much more militant because the threat of the state is immediate.
It's also a different economic reality. If you refuse state funding in Israel, you're basically committing your community to a life of poverty, unless you have massive outside support.
And they do. The global network of anti-Zionist charity is one of the most sophisticated shadow economies in the world. They have to be. If you won't take a shekel from the Ministry of Education, you have to find that money somewhere else. This creates a weird dynamic where these communities are both incredibly insular and globally connected. They are anti-state, but they are pro-community to an extreme degree.
I want to go back to the three oaths for a minute, because that seems to be the hinge everything swings on. Is there any debate within that world about whether the oaths are still valid? I mean, if the nations of the world did oppress the Jews too much, as in the Holocaust, doesn't that break the contract?
That is exactly what the religious Zionists argue. They say the contract was voided in 1945. They argue that the establishment of the state was actually God giving the Jews a wink and saying, "The exile is over, come home." But the anti-Zionists, specifically the Satmar, argue that the oaths are absolute. They say that even if one side breaks the oath, the other side is still bound by it. It's a very legalistic view of the divine-human relationship. To them, the redemption must be supernatural. If there are planes and tanks and voting booths involved, it's not the redemption.
It's a very patient, or maybe passive view of history. You wait for God to act, and until he does, you stay in your lane, even if that lane is a tiny alleyway in a neighborhood that hasn't changed much since the 19th century.
And there's a certain beauty in that consistency, even if you find the politics distasteful. There is a commitment to an idea that transcends the success of the modern world, but it also creates these bizarre edge cases. Like, what happens if the state were actually to be dismantled? Some of these groups, in their literature, suggest they would prefer to live under a non-Jewish, even an Arab, administration, as long as they were allowed to practice their religion, because that would restore the natural state of exile.
That is a bold position to take when you look at the reality of the Middle East. It's easy to say you'd prefer a different government when you're currently protected by the Iron Dome.
And that is the primary critique from the rest of the Jewish world. They call it parasitism. The idea that these groups are enjoying the safety and the economy created by the Zionists while simultaneously praying for the destruction of the entity that provides that safety. It's a very bitter divide, but for the anti-Zionists, the spiritual danger of recognizing a heretical state is far greater than the physical danger of living under a different regime. They are playing a much longer game, a game that spans centuries, not election cycles.
So, looking at the practical takeaways here, because Daniel's prompt really gets at the heart of identity, what does this tell us about the broader Jewish world? If this group is only 1%, why should the other 99% care?
They should care because these groups act as a theological conscience, even if it's a prickly one. They represent the pure form of a debate that has been happening for 2,000 years. How do we balance our desire for sovereignty with our commitment to divine law? Even for secular Jews, the existence of these guardians of the city is a reminder that there is a version of Jewish identity that is completely untethered from the modern nation state.
It also humbles the political discourse a bit. We tend to talk about the Jewish community as this monolithic bloc, especially when it comes to Israel. But when you realize there are people who look the part, the black hats, the beards, the whole thing, who are actually the most vocal opponents of the state, it forces you to embrace the nuance.
It really does. And for listeners who want to understand the Middle East, you have to understand that Haredi does not equal Zionist. In fact, the most religious people in the room might be the ones most opposed to the political project of the country. If you're trying to decode Israeli politics or global Jewish sentiment, you have to look at the theological why behind the what.
One thing I'm curious about, Herman, you mentioned the Ida Hacharidis earlier. They seem like the most organized version of this. How do they handle the day-to-day interactions? Like, if a pipe bursts in Mea Sherem, do they call the city water department?
They do, but they'll complain about it the whole time. No, in all seriousness, they have their own parallel systems for almost everything. They have their own ambulances. Hatzalah started in these types of communities, their own firewatch groups, and their own mediation services so they don't have to use the Zionist courts. It's about minimizing the benefit they receive from the state. It's a philosophy of as much as necessary but as little as possible.
And what about the future? Daniel asked how these groups are doing. Are they growing? Are they shrinking?
They are growing purely due to demographics. Haredi families, especially in these anti-Zionist factions, often have 8 to 10 children. Even with some people leaving the community, the off-the-derrick phenomenon, the sheer birth rate means their influence is expanding. This is one of the biggest challenges for the state of Israel in the next 20 years. If a significant percentage of your population doesn't believe in the legitimacy of the state, doesn't serve in the military, and doesn't participate in the workforce in a traditional way, how do you maintain a modern economy?
It's a demographic time bomb with a theological fuse.
That is exactly what it is, and it's why the conscription crisis is so intense right now. The state realizes it can no longer afford to have a state within a state, but the state within a state believes it has a divine mandate to remain separate. It's an immovable object meeting an irresistible force.
I think the most interesting part of this for me is the exile concept. The idea that you can be standing in the holiest place on earth, in the city of your ancestors, and still feel like you are in galut, in exile. It's a very deep, almost poetic sense of displacement.
It's the ultimate stranger in a strange land vibe, even when the land is technically yours. It's a reminder that for some people, home isn't a place on a map, it's a specific set of conditions. The Messiah, the temple, the divine presence. Until those conditions are met, they are just camping out, even if the tent is made of stone.
So, to recap for Daniel, the percentage is small, roughly 1% of world Jewry if you're talking about the hardcore ideological anti-Zionists. The factions are primarily Satmar, Neturei Karta, and the Ida Hacharidis umbrella, and they live there because the land is a religious requirement, even if the state is a religious error. They are the ultimate indigenous dissenters.
Well said. And I think the takeaway for anyone following this is to avoid the Zionism is Judaism shorthand. It's a common trope, but as these groups show, the relationship is much more fraught and much more interesting than that. Whether you agree with them or not, and most people, including most Jews, don't, you have to respect the sheer stubborn endurance of their position. They've survived the Roman Empire, the Crusades, and the British Mandate. They aren't going to let a modern parliament tell them how to be Jewish.
It's a level of don't care that you have to almost admire. They're playing the ultimate long game. We'll wait another 2,000 years if we have to.
And in the meantime, they'll keep speaking Yiddish and refusing to vote. It's a fascinating slice of humanity that rarely gets a fair shake in the mainstream media because they don't fit into the pro-Israel or anti-Israel boxes we're used to. They are pro-God, anti-state, and that's a category all its own.
Well, I think we've thoroughly deconstructed the paradox Daniel sent over. It's not a contradiction if you change the lens you're looking through. If the lens is theology over politics, then everything they do makes perfect sense.
I mean, sorry, I shouldn't say exactly. It's just as you said, Corn. The lens is everything. If you don't understand the 3 oaths, you don't understand the neighborhood.
You almost said the forbidden word, Herman. I saw you catch yourself. The donkey's getting smarter.
Hey, I'm trying. It's hard to break the habit when you're as enthusiastic as I am. But you're right, the substance is what matters, not the validation.
And the substance here is that Jewish identity is way more complex than the slogans we see on the news. Thanks to Daniel for sending this in. It's a great reminder that even in a place as small as Israel, there are worlds within worlds.
And thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
Also, a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and let us dive into these deep technical and theological rabbit holes.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying these deep dives, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who are looking for something a bit more substantive than the usual surface level takes.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel decides to throw at us.
Until then, stay curious, and maybe learn a few words of Yiddish just in case.
Goodbye for now.
See ya! This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth.